What if faith itself became a weapon? What if the very devotion that should inspire hope instead twisted the hearts of men and primarchs, alike into instruments of destruction? In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, but for some, war is not enough. For Lorgar Aurelian, the Primarch of the word-bearers, faith was everything. And yet, it became his greatest curse. Picture a galaxy consumed by chaos, where storms rage across alien skies and worlds burn beneath the weight of endless conflict. Amid the smoke and fire, one figure stands apart, not for his might in battle alone, but for the conviction that drives him. Lorgar was born of genius, molded by the Emperor himself, and raised to be a beacon of leadership for humanity. Yet even his brilliance carried a shadow. From the very beginning, Lorgar's heart was bound not merely to victory, but to something far more dangerous, the idea that loyalty and worship are the ultimate forms of power. In the beginning, Lorgar's devotion seemed pure, almost beautiful. He preached obedience, faith, and reverence, inspiring the men of his legion, the word-bearers, to see the Emperor as more than a ruler, but as a god. For a time, hope blossomed even in the darkest corners of the Imperium. Yet the Emperor, ever cautious and unyielding, saw the danger in such fanaticism. Faith, untempered, is a double-edged sword. And Lorgar, driven by a desire to be loved, revered, and understood, could not comprehend the Emperor's rejection. This rejection would set him on a path of ruin. Imagine the horror of a Primarch, towering and godlike, witnessing the destruction of his own faith at the hands of the very being he adored. The city of Monarchia, a shining jewel of devotion and worship, was reduced to ash and blood, a testament to the cold, unfeeling might of the Emperor. And in that devastation, Lorgar's soul cracked, fissures widening with every scream that echoed across the ruins. The very devotion that had once inspired him became a source of rage, despair, and ultimately, a yearning for vengeance. Yet even as the flames of Monarchia consumed the innocent, Lorgar's story was only beginning. What followed was a descent into darkness so profound that it reshaped the galaxy itself. Chaos whispered to him, offering solace and power in exchange for devotion, an echo of the same faith he once cherished, now twisted into a weapon of terror. The word-bearers, once champions of hope and order, became heralds of corruption, spreading fear, chaos, and despair across countless worlds. In this tale, there are no heroes, only tragedy, betrayal, and the horrifying power of faith turned to darkness. Over the next hour, you will witness Lorgar's journey from the heights of devotion to the abyss of corruption. A story filled with shocking revelations, emotional torment, and the echoes of a galaxy forever scarred by his choices. Prepare yourself, for the whispers of Lorgar's word-bearers are already at the edge of your hearing, and they will not let you go. Before he became a figure of legend and terror, Lorgar Aurelian was a child of Colchis, a harsh and unforgiving world at the edge of the galaxy. Colchis was not a place of innocence or gentle upbringing. It was a world of harsh winds, dense jungles, and superstitious people who lived under the ever-watchful eyes of their rulers. Even as a child, Lorgar stood apart. While other children played or feared the dangers around them, he felt a pull, an almost unnatural obsession with meaning, devotion, and purpose. From the beginning, he sought order and reverence in everything he touched, but the world of Colchis was cruel, and the seeds of hardship were sown early. Lorgar's people lived in constant struggle against the elements, tribal rivalries, and the capricious whims of those in power. Violence, disease, and death were ever present, shaping him into someone who understood both the fragility and the brutality of life. Yet instead of despair, Lorgar found solace in something intangible, the idea of worship, of devotion, of a higher authority that could bring order to chaos. Even as a boy, he was drawn to rituals and rites, studying the prayers and incantations of Colchis' elders, absorbing their fervor as if it were nourishment. It was during this time that the first whispers of his future destiny began. Those around him, children and adults alike, were drawn to him in a way that was almost unnatural. They listened to his words as though he were speaking truths from beyond the stars, bowing and performing rituals that even the elders could barely comprehend. To outsiders, it may have looked like simple obedience, but there was something darker, something unsettling in the devotion he inspired. The very air seemed charged when Lorgar spoke, the jungle itself bending to the rhythm of his voice, as if acknowledging the power he would one day wield, even in these early days. Shadows of what was to come crept into his life. His obsession with devotion became more than admiration, it became a compulsion. He demanded ritual, order, and faith, not as an expression of kindness or guidance, but as a test of loyalty. The line between worship and fanaticism blurred, and those who faltered, those who failed to meet his expectations, were not punished with cruelty, but with cold disappointment that chilled the heart. Lorgar's early followers, already drawn to his magnetic presence, became a proto-word bearers legion of their own, performing rites with meticulous precision, their chants echoing through the dense Kalongan jungles like a foreboding hymn. Foreshadowing of his fall was subtle but unmistakable. In the silent, watchful moments, when the fires of Kalonga lit the night and the jungle whispered in the wind, Lorgar often gazed at the stars with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He asked questions not meant for answers, demanding to understand the nature of divinity, of authority, of ultimate truth. And even as he sought guidance, there was a darkness creeping in, an eagerness to embrace extremes, a willingness to see destruction as a form of devotion. The seeds of chaos were not yet planted, but the soil had been carefully tilled. Kalonga shaped Lorgar into a Primarch of obsession, discipline, and terrifying charisma. From this harsh world, he carried not just strength, but the dark conviction that faith, above all else, was the ultimate power. It was a conviction that would one day shake the Imperium itself. When Lorgar Aurelian first emerged from the shadows of Kalonga, he was already unlike any other Primarch. Where his brothers led with strategy, martial skill, or personal charisma alone, Lorgar led with faith and a force of conviction that could bend minds and hearts alike. He did not inspire through fear or brute strength. He inspired through something far more potent, the promise of divine purpose. And it was this promise that would shape the word bearers into a legion unlike any other in the Imperium, a legion whose devotion was fanatical, terrifying, and eventually inexorably corruptible. From the earliest days of their campaigns, the word bearers were unlike any other Space Marine legion. While other Primarchs emphasized tactics, discipline, or personal valor, Lorgar insisted on ritual, prayer, and worship. Every march, every battle, every act of conquest was framed not simply as a military operation, but as a sacred mission. The soldiers were not merely warriors. They were devotees, missionaries, and pilgrims in the service of a higher truth. Their armor was adorned with symbols not only of the Emperor, but of ritual, of liturgy, of chants passed down in solemn procession. Their banners bore prayers as much as they bore the sigils of war. But Lorgar did not stop at symbolism. He sought to reshape the very hearts and minds of his followers. Emotional manipulation became his craft, and he wielded it with terrifying skill. Soldiers were trained to believe that they were fighting not just for victory, but for salvation itself. To fail in battle was not merely to risk death, it was to risk eternal dishonor, to lose the grace of their God Emperor, to fall into a spiritual abyss from which there was no return. Even the most hardened warriors, the largest and fiercest of his legionnaires, bowed and knelt under his gaze, whispering prayers before charging into the maw of battle. They believed with every fiber of their being that their purpose was sacred. Lorgar's methods were subtle yet relentless. He preached constantly, not of conquest, not of dominion, but of devotion. Every victory was attributed not to strategy or luck, but to the will of the Emperor manifesting through faith. Every setback was a test of resolve, a challenge to see whether his warriors were truly worthy of their sacred charge. In his sermons and addresses, he painted the Imperium as a sacred body in need of purification, a galaxy in which faith could bring order or chaos if neglected. And in the silence between his words, in the quiet shadows of the night, he planted seeds of doubt, curiosity, and the hunger for something greater, something transcendent. The emotional hold he had over his followers was profound. Soldiers came to see themselves as instruments of divine will, their identity inseparable from the faith Lorgar instilled in them. They became willing to endure horrors beyond mortal comprehension, unending campaigns, ritualistic trials of pain, and the constant fear of failing their sacred purpose. And yet, in all this, they felt a sense of fulfillment and purpose that no other legion could provide. They were chosen, blessed, and eternally devoted, not to Lorgar himself, but to the divine truth he promised to reveal. Yet even as Lorgar shaped the hearts of his legion, shadows of corruption quietly crept in. Fanaticism, unchecked and unbalanced, is a fertile soil for darkness. The very devotion that had made his soldiers unstoppable would become the instrument of their and the galaxy's doom. Small acts, seemingly innocent in isolation, hinted at the legion's capacity for cruelty, excessive punishment for perceived disloyalty, ritualized executions of enemies, and an obsession with purity that bordered on mania. Every chant, every prayer, every ritual reinforced the idea that faith alone justified all acts, no matter how brutal. The seeds of fanaticism were sown deep, and there was no turning back. The word-bearers' campaigns were marked by a chilling consistency, a fusion of military precision and religious ritual that was profoundly disorienting to their enemies. Victories were celebrated with liturgies. Fallen enemies were ritually cursed or desecrated. Cities were not merely conquered, they were spiritually subjugated. And through it all, Lorgar's presence was pervasive. He moved among his legionnaires not only as commander, but as high priest, confessor, and judge. His gaze alone could elevate or damn, and the soldiers of the word-bearers internalized this completely, seeing obedience as both sacred duty and survival. Yet, Lorgar was not content with mere obedience. He pushed his legion further, deliberately testing the limits of their devotion, pushing them into acts that other legions would recoil from. Battles became sermons, death became ritual, and the line between righteousness and horror blurred. Soldiers came to fear less the enemy than the failure of faith itself, a fear that Lorgar carefully cultivated, knowing that terror is one of the most potent tools of control. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the word-bearers transformed. They were no longer simply a legion of warriors, they were instruments of spiritual domination. A terrifying embodiment of the idea that faith, unchecked and twisted, can corrupt absolutely. The corruption did not happen overnight. It crept like a shadow, invisible at first, then undeniable. Soldiers who once found solace in Lorgar's teachings began to seek power through devotion, measuring themselves against one another in a grim hierarchy of faith. Ritual became obsession. Obsession became fanaticism. And fanaticism became a form of terror so complete that even the strongest minds of the Imperium would recoil at their actions. The word-bearers were no longer just a military force. They were a dark mirror, reflecting what happens when purpose and power become inseparable from belief. And through it all, Lorgar watched. He saw the fire in their eyes, the unshakable certainty of their conviction, and he nurtured it like a gardener tending to a deadly bloom. Every act of obedience, every prayer chanted on the battlefield, was a step further along the path that he himself would one day walk, a path where devotion leads not to salvation, but to horror, and where the galaxy itself becomes the altar for faith gone mad. By the end of this rise, the word-bearers were complete in their terrifying purpose, a legion of fanatic warriors, emotionally bound to their faith, capable of unspeakable acts in the name of devotion. And lurking behind it all was the faint, almost imperceptible shadow of what was to come, the whisper of chaos, the lure of greater power, and the beginning of Lorgar's ultimate descent. For even in his devotion to the Emperor, there was the seed of rebellion, the latent horror that faith, unchecked, can turn even the most devoted heart into a weapon of ruin. The city of Monarchia had once been a beacon of faith. Golden spires pierced alien skies, banners of devotion fluttered in the wind, and the streets thrummed with chants and prayers. It was Lorgar's triumph, a living monument to the ideals he had nurtured since childhood: devotion, order, and purpose. Here, faith was not merely a belief, it was a way of life. Every citizen, every soldier, every priest recognized the sacred role of the Emperor, and under Lorgar's guidance, Monarchia flourished as a symbol of unity and reverence. But in the grim darkness of the far future, no triumph lasts unchallenged. The Emperor, ever vigilant and merciless in his pursuit of order, saw the growth of Monarchia as a dangerous deviation from his plans. He did not punish Lorgar with subtlety, nor did he employ diplomacy. The Emperor's decree was absolute. Monarchia would be destroyed, and Lorgar would learn the harshest lesson of obedience. The full weight of the Emperor's authority fell upon the city, like a dark shadow swallowing the light. Imagine the scene: a city of gold and devotion reduced to ash in the blink of an eye. Explosions tore through spires and cathedrals. Fires consumed the homes of innocent civilians who had only ever known worship and reverence. Priests who had spent their lives guiding the faithful were hurled into flames. Soldiers of the word-bearers, bound by oath to their Primarch, tried in vain to resist the inexorable might of the Emperor's legions. But even their fanatical devotion could not stem the tide of annihilation. Streets ran red with blood. The air was filled with screams that echoed off stone and steel, a cacophony of horror that would haunt the galaxy for centuries. Lorgar himself bore witness to this devastation. For the first time, the heart that had inspired such unwavering devotion trembled with helpless rage. He saw his life's work, his city, his people, his sacred vision obliterated before his eyes. The destruction was not random. It was deliberate, precise, a cold and calculated lesson in humility. The Emperor did not merely strike. He erased. Monarchia was purged, and Lorgar's soul was left exposed to the raw, unbearable reality of power without mercy. The horror was compounded by the Emperor's presence, distant and absolute, a figure whose coldness was more terrifying than the flames themselves. He did not raise his voice in anger. He did not offer a word of counsel or comfort. His gaze alone, measured and unyielding, conveyed the full weight of judgment. In that moment, Lorgar understood the brutal truth of the Imperium. Even the most devoted, even the most obedient, could be broken, and obedience alone would not protect them from the Emperor's will. The silence between commands was deafening, a void filled with the cries of the innocent and the dying. The emotional trauma for Lorgar was overwhelming. Rage surged, unrestrained, yet it was intertwined with despair so deep it threatened to consume him entirely. He had dedicated himself to faith, to devotion, to service, but now he understood the fragility of even the greatest loyalty. Every life lost in Monarchia was a reflection of his failure, a mirror that showed him the limits of his influence and the terrifying reach of authority that did not care for intent. Only obedience died in the chaos. Lorgar's mind began to fracture. He saw the faces of the citizens, the children, the priests, the warriors who had believed in his vision and felt the unbearable weight of guilt and impotence. Their devotion had been genuine, pure even, yet it had led only to annihilation. Rage burned within him, but it was a rage mingled with sorrow, a sorrow so profound that it could not be expressed in words. In his heart, he vowed that the future would never allow such helplessness again. Though he did not yet know the path he would take, even as the fires raged and the city crumbled. The Word-Bearer's legion remained at his side. Their eyes reflected the same horror, the same confusion, the same dawning realization that devotion alone could not protect them. Yet in Lorgar's presence, their fear became a tool, and their faith, a weapon waiting to be honed. He would not abandon them. He could not. And in that decision, the first glimmers of corruption began to take root. The seeds of chaos, long dormant, stirred at the edges of his mind, whispering promises of power, vengeance, and purpose beyond the cold judgment of the Emperor. The destruction of Monarchia was more than a military defeat. It was a psychological crucible. Lorgar emerged not broken, but transformed. He carried within him a deep wound, an emotional scar that would define every choice thereafter. He learned that even the most devout could be powerless, that obedience without understanding could be fatal, and that the galaxy was a place where ideals alone were not enough to survive. The horror he witnessed, the screams he heard, and the cold, unyielding presence of the Emperor would haunt him forever. And yet, in the midst of despair, a dangerous clarity emerged. Lorgar began to see a path forward, one where faith itself could be wielded as a weapon, where devotion could be turned into a force unstoppable even by the Emperor. The Word-Bearers had learned obedience, but they had also learned to channel their fear, grief, and loyalty into something more profound, an instrument of terror and influence. Lorgar's vision had shifted, from mere service to the Emperor to a broader, darker purpose. He would not simply accept defeat again. He would forge a new path, one that blurred the lines between salvation and damnation, between devotion and horror. Monarchia's ashes were the crucible of Lorgar's transformation. The city's destruction was the horror that shaped a Primarch, the trauma that fueled a legion, and the lesson that faith, unchecked faith in the wrong hands, could either save or destroy entire worlds. From the flames of despair, Lorgar's shadow would rise, carrying with it not hope, but something far more terrifying, the promise that faith, twisted and wielded with intent, could become the most dangerous weapon the galaxy had ever known. The fires of Monarchia had long since died, leaving behind nothing but ash, smoke, and the echoes of the screams that would haunt Lorgar forever. Yet in the grim darkness of the galaxy, destruction does not mark the end, it marks the beginning. For Lorgar Aurelian, the devastation of his city, the obliteration of his dreams, and the cold, unyielding judgment of the Emperor became not merely a wound, but a gateway. A gateway to something horrifying, seductive, and inevitable. Chaos. At first, it was subtle. A whisper here, a fleeting shadow there. Lorgar, still consumed by grief and rage, felt voices in the darkness, voices that spoke to the emptiness left by the Emperor's cold lesson. They did not command him outright, they suggested, hinted, coaxed. They asked questions that the galaxy itself could not answer. Why obey a god who does not see you? Why kneel to one who punishes devotion? What is the purpose of faith if it cannot protect? The words were not loud. They were intimate, threading themselves into his mind like smoke curling around a flame. The whispers of chaos were terrifying. They were neither wholly malevolent nor benevolent. They existed in a space beyond human comprehension, their intentions incomprehensible, yet irresistible. They showed him visions, flashes of impossible worlds, of power beyond the limits of mortal understanding, of war unending, yet perfectly ordered under the hand of those who wielded devotion as a weapon. Lorgar could see it all, the might of the chaos gods, the infinity of the warp, the power that could bend reality itself. And the more he saw, the more he felt a dark exhilaration he had never known before. It was not a simple seduction. It was a psychological horror so profound that it shook him to his core. Each vision tore at the foundations of his identity. He was the loyal son of the Emperor, a Primarch destined to serve, yet he also glimpsed the boundless freedom of choosing his own destiny. unconstrained by loyalty, morality, or fear of judgment. The whispers promised power, understanding, and revenge, all packaged as divine purpose. And in the quiet moments when the galaxy seemed empty and the screams of Monarchia still echoed in his mind, Lorgar began to realize that the only path to prevent such devastation again was to embrace that which the Emperor had forbidden. Chaos itself, the seduction of power, was not immediate. It was a slow, creeping horror. Lorgar began to experiment in secret, testing the boundaries of his devotion. He learned to call upon the energies of the warp, feeling the tendrils of demonic influence brush against his mind, whispering secrets too terrible to speak aloud. Each time he reached further, the sensations were terrifying and intoxicating all at once. The warp offered clarity and madness in equal measure. He saw battles won before they were fought, secrets whispered by the stars, and futures that existed and did not exist simultaneously. He felt the awe of creation itself bending to his will, and the fear of losing himself entirely. Even as the allure of chaos grew, Lorgar's psychological torment intensified. He remembered Monarchia, the cries of the innocents, the destruction of everything he had built, the cold, unfeeling Emperor. Every act of devotion, every prayer, every ritual of faith he had nurtured seemed insufficient, powerless, meaningless. And yet, the Chaos Gods offered what the Emperor never could: acknowledgement, power, and a vision of devotion that would be absolute, unchallenged, and eternal. The emotional weight of betrayal, despair, and hunger for control coalesced into a terrifying certainty: he would not kneel again. The word-bearers themselves began to change. Lorgar's visions were shared, subtly at first, in whispers to the most devout soldiers. They too felt the seduction of power, the thrill of communion with forces beyond the Imperium's understanding. The chants of the Legion shifted in tone. No longer were they simple hymns to the Emperor, they became invocations to something greater, something dark. Rituals grew more elaborate, more extreme, as the soldiers sought to channel their devotion into a tangible form of power. The boundaries between religion and horror blurred, and the very act of worship became an instrument of terror. What made Lorgar's descent into chaos so horrifying was not only the external transformation of the Legion, but the internal rupture of his soul. He did not feel joy, nor hatred, nor simple ambition. He felt the mingling of all these emotions, amplified beyond comprehension. The whispers of the Chaos Gods intertwined with his grief, rage, and desperation, creating a psychic storm that threatened to consume him. Each step further into the warp's influence was both a liberation and a damnation. He felt awe at the power available to him, and simultaneous fear at the potential cost of losing his humanity entirely. The psychological horror reached its apex when Lorgar began to realize that the galaxy itself was a stage for his devotion and his vengeance. Worlds could be shaped or destroyed by faith. Armies could be twisted into instruments of worship and terror. Reality itself could bend to the will of those who understood the seductive truth of chaos. It was a revelation of infinite possibilities and infinite horrors. Every choice carried the weight of eternity. Every act of devotion could either elevate or damn. The magnitude of what lay before him was incomprehensible, and yet irresistible. By the time Lorgar fully embraced chaos, he was no longer simply a Primarch of the Emperor. He had become something more, something terrible and awe-inspiring, a prophet of power, a master of fear, a high priest of a devotion that could destroy entire worlds. His fall was inevitable, yes, but it was also horrifying in its inevitability. For he did not merely succumb. He chose the path with eyes wide open, knowing the consequences yet unable to resist the promise of absolute power. And as the word-bearer's legion knelt before him, chanting invocations to the unseen forces that had seduced their Primarch, Lorgar stood at the center of a new order, a darkness born from faith, a terror intertwined with purpose, and a vision of the galaxy remade in the image of devotion turned to horror. The whispers of chaos had become his voice. The visions had become his reality. And in the echoing corridors of the warp, Lorgar Aurelian's shadow would stretch across the stars, forever altering the fate of the Imperium.
The seeds of betrayal, planted in the shadow of Monarchia and nurtured in the whispers of the warp, had begun to bear fruit. Lorgar Aurelian, once a loyal son of the Emperor, now a prophet of chaos, turned his gaze toward the figure whose ambition and pride made him both vulnerable and indispensable, Horus, Warmaster of the Imperium, the Emperor's chosen. Where Lorgar saw opportunity, Horus saw loyalty, yet it was precisely Horus's devotion that Lorgar would exploit, transforming brotherhood into a weapon of unimaginable betrayal. The psychological manipulation of Horus was not sudden, nor was it overt. Lorgar understood the mind of his brother, the subtle vulnerabilities that pride and ambition created. Through whispered counsel, shared visions of the galaxy's fragility, and careful exaggerations of the Emperor's detachment, he began to sow doubt. Why do you serve a father who cannot see you? Who would sacrifice all your victories for his distant designs? Who cares for those who bleed for the Imperium? These words, spoken in the quiet moments between battles, lingered like shadows, wrapping themselves around Horus's thoughts, twisting them. Lorgar's manipulations were layered and insidious. He did not merely appeal to ambition, he preyed upon fear, grief, and the subtle desires of the heart. The galaxy was vast, unending, and full of suffering, he told Horus. The Emperor could not protect it all, could not be everywhere at once, and in his absence, others must take up the mantle. Lorgar painted a vision of salvation achieved through power, not obedience, suggesting that devotion to chaos was not sin, but a path to liberation, a means to save the Imperium that the Emperor had neglected. The horror of Lorgar's method lay not only in its subtlety, but in its effectiveness. Horus, a figure of immense pride and exceptional capability, began to question his purpose. Doubt festered, turning loyalty into hesitation, hesitation into suspicion, and suspicion into resentment. Each conversation, each subtle suggestion from Lorgar, became a thread in a web that would eventually ensnare the Warmaster himself. And as Horus's mind turned, the galaxy trembled, for the brothers' fall would unleash a chain of events from which no world could escape. The corruption spread like a dark plague, touching not just Horus but the entire galaxy. Lorgar's influence encouraged the Warmaster to gather those discontented with the Emperor, those who had long felt constrained by duty or slighted by command. Loyalist Primarchs, once bastions of hope and stability, watched with growing dread as their brothers, one by one, aligned with Horus's cause. Fear, despair, and confusion rippled through the Imperium, creating a psychic atmosphere thick with tension and foreboding. It was as if the very stars themselves mourned the coming betrayal. For the Loyalist Primarchs, the emotional weight was unbearable. They could see the inevitability unfolding before their eyes, yet they were powerless to intervene. They witnessed brothers they had fought beside for millennia now turning, corrupted by whispers and visions, their loyalty supplanted by ambition and fear. The horror of mass betrayal was compounded by its personal nature. Each act of treachery carried the sting of intimate knowledge, shared history, and once sacred bonds now shattered. Every battle fought under the banner of the Emperor was tainted, for the enemy was no longer distant or alien, it was kin, corrupted by devotion twisted into malevolent purpose. Lorgar's genius was in understanding the inevitability of tragedy. He did not need to force Horus into rebellion, he merely guided, suggesting, showing possibilities, and allowing Horus to choose. And the choice seemed rational, even noble, to the Warmaster. In this, Lorgar's manipulation was horrifyingly elegant. He created the illusion of agency, while orchestrating a fall that was as inevitable as it was devastating. Horus's betrayal was not a single act of treachery, but a slow, inexorable collapse of trust, devotion, and purpose. The galaxy itself became a stage for horror. Worlds that had known peace fell into chaos, planets loyal to the Emperor were shattered by conflict, betrayal, and civil war. Entire fleets were turned against former allies, and the blood of countless innocents stained the stars. Lorgar's influence ensured that this destruction was not merely tactical, it was spiritual and psychological. Soldiers of the Word-bearers and Horus's forces acted with conviction, believing that they fought for salvation, even as they wrought death and devastation on their brethren. Faith became the instrument of war, and horror became inseparable from purpose. Every confrontation between loyalist and traitor Primarchs carried emotional weight that few could comprehend. Battles were fought not only with weapons, but with the raw power of devotion and despair. Lorgar watched these events unfold with a grim satisfaction, understanding the tragic inevitability of war on this scale. Each victory for Horus, each world consumed by fire, was a confirmation of the principles Lorgar had cultivated for decades, that faith, unchecked and twisted, could command the loyalty of thousands and shape the destiny of a galaxy. And yet, even as the Word-bearers and Horus's forces marched across the stars, Lorgar remained more than a manipulator. He became a prophet of chaos, a conductor of despair and awe. The galaxy's descent into civil war was not random, it was orchestrated, nurtured through whispers, visions, and careful nudges that transformed personal ambition into galactic catastrophe. Loyalty became fear, devotion became fanaticism, love and brotherhood became tools to break bonds and spread corruption. The audience, watching the story unfold, is meant to feel the tragic inevitability of these events. The horror is not in the violence alone, but in the intimate betrayal, the collapse of trust, and the emotional despair of those who could do nothing to stop it. The galaxy is doomed not merely by war, but by manipulation, subtle whispers, and the slow, almost poetic inevitability of Lorgar's plan. The Horus Heresy is not a sudden storm, it is a shadow that had been growing for decades, and Lorgar, the prophet of corrupted devotion, is its guiding hand. By the time Horus fully embraces rebellion, the Word-bearers have achieved their ultimate purpose, not just to spread chaos, but to demonstrate the terrifying power of faith when twisted by grief, rage, and ambition. Lorgar's manipulation ensured that every act of betrayal felt natural, inevitable, and even righteous to those involved. The horror is complete, the galaxy is engulfed in war, brother turns against brother, and the consequences of devotion corrupted into malice cannot be undone.
Lorgar's genius was in understanding the inevitability of tragedy. He did not need to force Horus into rebellion, he merely guided, suggesting, showing possibilities, and allowing Horus to choose. And the choice seemed rational, even noble, to the Warmaster. In this, Lorgar's manipulation was horrifyingly elegant. He created the illusion of agency, while orchestrating a fall that was as inevitable as it was devastating. Horus's betrayal was not a single act of treachery, but a slow, inexorable collapse of trust, devotion, and purpose. The galaxy itself became a stage for horror. Worlds that had known peace fell into chaos. Planets loyal to the Emperor were shattered by conflict, betrayal, and civil war. Entire fleets were turned against former allies, and the blood of countless innocents stained the stars. Lorgar's influence ensured that this destruction was not merely tactical, it was spiritual and psychological. Soldiers of the Word-bearers and Horus's forces acted with conviction, believing that they fought for salvation, even as they wrought death and devastation on their brethren. Faith became the instrument of war, and horror became inseparable from purpose. Every confrontation between loyalist and traitor Primarchs carried emotional weight that few could comprehend. Battles were fought not only with weapons, but with the raw power of devotion and despair. Lorgar watched these events unfold with a grim satisfaction, understanding the tragic inevitability of war on this scale. Each victory for Horus, each world consumed by fire, was a confirmation of the principles Lorgar had cultivated for decades, that faith, unchecked and twisted, could command the loyalty of thousands and shape the destiny of a galaxy. And yet, even as the word-bearers and Horus's forces marched across the stars, Lorgar remained more than a manipulator. He became a prophet of chaos, a conductor of despair and awe. The galaxy's descent into civil war was not random, it was orchestrated, nurtured through whispers, visions, and careful nudges that transformed personal ambition into galactic catastrophe. Loyalty became fear, devotion became fanaticism, love and brotherhood became tools to break bonds and spread corruption. The audience, watching the story unfold, is meant to feel the tragic inevitability of these events. The horror is not in the violence alone, but in the intimate betrayal, the collapse of trust, and the emotional despair of those who could do nothing to stop it. The galaxy is doomed not merely by war, but by manipulation, subtle whispers, and the slow, almost poetic inevitability of Lorgar's plan. The Horus Heresy is not a sudden storm, it is a shadow that had been growing for decades, and Lorgar, the prophet of corrupted devotion, is its guiding hand. By the time Horus fully embraces rebellion, the word-bearers have achieved their ultimate purpose, not just to spread chaos, but to demonstrate the terrifying power of faith when twisted by grief, rage, and ambition. Lorgar's manipulation ensured that every act of betrayal felt natural, inevitable, and even righteous to those involved. The horror is complete, the galaxy is engulfed in war, brother turns against brother, and the consequences of devotion corrupted into malice cannot be undone.
The galaxy is never the same once faith is twisted. Lorgar Aurelian, once a child of Colchis, once a devoted son of the Emperor, now stands as a figure whose shadow stretches across millennia. His story is not one of simple triumph or defeat, it is a tale of horror, awe, and the terrifying consequences of devotion unbound by morality. The word-bearers, his legion, continue their dark mission, spreading fanaticism, corruption, and terror wherever their chants echo. And the galaxy, scarred and haunted, has learned that the line between salvation and damnation is thinner than a whispered prayer. In the quiet corners of the Imperium, the effects of Lorgar's legacy linger. Planets once loyal to the Emperor now murmur in secrecy, temples filled with devotees whose chants are no longer hymns of light, but invocations of darkness. Children are raised in the shadow of fear, adults taught that obedience is survival, and soldiers trained to merge devotion with violence. Entire worlds are psychologically fractured, their sense of purpose warped by whispers of unseen powers and the enduring influence of a Primarch who understood faith as both weapon and cage. The horror of Lorgar's vision is not only in the death and destruction he caused, but in the emotional and spiritual weight he left behind. Survivors of word-bearers' raids do not merely carry scars, they carry doubt, despair, and the haunting knowledge that loyalty and devotion can be corrupted, twisted into tools of terror. Each whisper in the dark, every secret congregation, every ritualized act of obedience reinforces the terrifying truth: even the purest heart can be seduced, even the strongest mind can be bent. Lorgar's genius lies in his understanding of this, and in his ability to exploit it across the galaxy. Yet, within this horror, there is also awe. Lorgar's descent into chaos, the transformation of the word-bearers, and the strategic manipulation of Horus are not merely acts of villainy, they are masterworks of psychological and spiritual power. To witness his influence is to understand the fragility of loyalty and the potential of faith. He is both prophet and terror, artist and destroyer, shaping the Imperium not through mere force of arms, but through the slow, insidious bending of hearts, minds, and belief. The awe is inseparable from fear, for Lorgar shows what devotion, twisted and amplified, can achieve. The tragedy of Lorgar's story lies in its inevitability. From the harsh jungles of Colonga to the smoldering ruins of Monarchia, the whispers of chaos, and the Horus Heresy itself, every event seems preordained. His fall is horrifying, yet it feels unavoidable, a domino effect set in motion by devotion, obsession, and the unforgiving lessons of the Emperor's coldness. The galaxy's descent into war, betrayal, and fanaticism is not merely the consequence of a single Primarch's choices, it is the result of the inherent danger in faith tempered by reason, the horror of devotion twisted into obsession, and the slow erosion of trust between brothers, friends, and worlds. As the word-bearers continue to spread across the stars, Lorgar's presence is felt in every whisper of the warp, every dark ritual, every hesitant, fearful glance of the faithful who wonder if their devotion is genuine, or if it has already been claimed by a darker purpose. His legacy is a shadow that refuses to fade. The galaxy may fight, resist, and survive, but the psychological and spiritual impact of Lorgar's actions is eternal. The Imperium has learned to fear not only the word-bearer's weapons, but the power of belief when wielded as a blade. The emotional resonance of Lorgar's story is undeniable. For every world burned, for every legion corrupted, there is a human cost, the despair of the loyalist Primarchs, the anguish of innocence, and the silent terror of those who understand too late the power of twisted devotion. Every act of horror committed by the word-bearers is amplified by purpose, every scream accompanied by the knowledge that the perpetrators believe they serve something higher. In this, the audience sees the duality of awe and horror, the seductive nature of power, the fragility of faith, and the chilling understanding that devotion can be weaponized against those it was meant to protect. In conclusion, Lorgar Aurelian is more than a villain, more than a traitor, and more than a figure of war. He is a cautionary tale of obsession, a study in the psychological horror of faith corrupted, and a testament to the terrifying potential of devotion wielded as a tool of power. From the jungles of Colonga to the battlefields of the Horus Heresy, from the ashes of Monarchia to the dark rituals whispered across the Imperium, his shadow endures. The galaxy trembles not merely under the might of his legion, but under the knowledge that faith, in the wrong hands, can destroy worlds, corrupt hearts, and shatter the bonds of brotherhood. Lorgar teaches a lesson that is both horrifying and awe-inspiring, that belief, twisted and perfected, is more potent than any weapon of steel or fire, more enduring than fleets or fortresses, and capable of shaping the destiny of a galaxy for millennia. As the camera of the mind's eye pans across the stars, we see the lingering traces of his influence, temples desecrated, cities turned into instruments of devotion, soldiers chanting in unison under the shadow of fear, and worlds left trembling under the weight of corrupted faith. The galaxy is a darker, quieter place, haunted by whispers of Lorgar Aurelian, and by the knowledge that, somewhere in the warp, the word-bearers continue their work. And so, the story ends not with closure, but with reflection. The audience is left with the chilling understanding that the galaxy, vast and infinite, is never safe from the shadow of obsession and the horror of twisted devotion. Lorgar's tale is complete, yet ongoing, horrifying, yet awe-inspiring, a story of faith transformed into weapon, and a reminder that in the grim darkness of the far future, terror and reverence are two sides of the same coin. The galaxy is never the same once faith is twisted. Lorgar Aurelian, once a child of Colonga, once a devoted son of the Emperor, now stands as a figure whose shadow stretches across millennia. His story is not one of simple triumph or defeat, it is a tale of horror, awe, and the terrifying consequences of devotion unbound by morality. The word-bearers, his legion, continue their dark mission, spreading fanaticism, corruption, and terror wherever their chants echo. And the galaxy, scarred and haunted, has learned that the line between salvation and damnation is thinner than a whispered prayer. In the quiet corners of the Imperium, the effects of Lorgar's legacy linger. Planets once loyal to the Emperor now murmur in secrecy, temples filled with devotees whose chants are no longer hymns of light, but invocations of darkness. Children are raised in the shadow of fear, adults taught that obedience is survival, and soldiers trained to merge devotion with violence. Entire worlds are psychologically fractured, their sense of purpose warped by whispers of unseen powers and the enduring influence of a Primarch who understood faith as both weapon and cage. The horror of Lorgar's vision is not only in the death and destruction he caused, but in the emotional and spiritual weight he left behind. Survivors of Word-Bearer's raids do not merely carry scars, they carry doubt, despair, and the haunting knowledge that loyalty and devotion can be corrupted, twisted into tools of terror. Each whisper in the dark, every secret congregation, every ritualized act of obedience reinforces the terrifying truth: even the purest heart can be seduced, even the strongest mind can be bent. Lorgar's genius lies in his understanding of this, and in his ability to exploit it across the galaxy. Yet, within this horror, there is also awe. Lorgar's descent into chaos, the transformation of the Word-Bearers, and the strategic manipulation of Horus are not merely acts of villainy, they are masterworks of psychological and spiritual power. To witness his influence is to understand the fragility of loyalty and the potential of faith. He is both prophet and terror, artist and destroyer, shaping the Imperium not through mere force of arms, but through the slow, insidious bending of hearts, minds, and belief. The awe is inseparable from fear, for Lorgar shows what devotion, twisted and amplified, can achieve. The tragedy of Lorgar's story lies in its inevitability. From the harsh jungles of Colchis to the smoldering ruins of Monarchia, the whispers of chaos, and the Horus Heresy itself, every event seems preordained. His fall is horrifying, yet it feels unavoidable, a domino effect set in motion by devotion, obsession, and the unforgiving lessons of the Emperor's coldness. The galaxy's descent into war, betrayal, and fanaticism is not merely the consequence of a single Primarch's choices, it is the result of the inherent danger in faith tempered by reason, the horror of devotion twisted into obsession, and the slow erosion of trust between brothers, friends, and worlds. As the Word-Bearers continue to spread across the stars, Lorgar's presence is felt in every whisper of the warp, every dark ritual, every hesitant, fearful glance of the faithful who wonder if their devotion is genuine, or if it has already been claimed by a darker purpose. His legacy is a shadow that refuses to fade. The galaxy may fight, resist, and survive, but the psychological and spiritual impact of Lorgar's actions is eternal. The Imperium has learned to fear not only the Word-Bearer's weapons, but the power of belief when wielded as a blade.